15-year-old black boy stood in the freezing mud before sunrise digging. Every morning before school, Everett Crane drove his borrowed spade into the clay along Coldwater Creek. His school shoes were ruined by Tuesday, his palms raw and blistered by Thursday. At first, none of the neighbors paid any attention to the boy. They had no idea he was preparing for a disaster that would soon wash their world away. Everett Crane knew he had to move fast. It was 5 a.m. in Casey County, Kentucky, and the autumn air was cold enough to freeze the breath in his chest like white smoke. Just 8 hours ago, a heavy rainstorm had beaten down on the farm, a relentless downpour that turned the gravel roads into rushing streams. A massive chunk of the South cornfield, about 4 acres of the family's most fertile bottomland, had slid right into Coldwater Creek. Dale Crane, Everett's father, had stood by the edge of the collapse with his hands in his pockets, silent. Dale was a proud man, a third-generation farmer, but he was also a man struggling to pay off the mortgage at the local bank. Everett saw the look in his father's eyes. It was the look of a farmer watching his livelihood wash away, helpless against the raw power of the river. The Crane family's old shovel had snapped its wooden handle 3 days ago, while clearing rocks from the drainage ditch. Everett couldn't wait for his father to buy a new one. There was no money for tools. He walked 1 mile down the muddy county road to his grandfather Lester Bowen's small cottage. The old man was 74, a retired soil conservation technician who had spent 40 years working for the state. He had thick glasses, a bent back, and hands that shook when he poured his morning coffee. Lester Bowen's cottage was built by his father in 1948, using local limestone and white oak logs. The chimney was made of river stones, and in the autumn, it smelled of dry maple leaves burning in the fireplace. Inside, his walls were lined with old books on agriculture, soil chemistry, and hydrology, some of which had water stains from past floods. The old cottage smelled of pine wood, smoke, ancient paper, and hot chicory coffee. "Take the spade, son," Lester said, pointing to the rusted iron tool leaning against the porch rail. "And take this." He handed Everett a yellowed USDA pamphlet from 1974. The paper was worn at the edges, filled with hand-drawn diagrams of plant roots. Everett shoved it into his pocket and headed back to the creek. By 5:14 a.m., Everett was standing in the gray mud. The creek was a steep slope of wet clay that sucked at his boots with every step. He didn't have money for expensive materials. He had no gravel, no timber. He only had his own muscles. Everett dug the rusted spade into the clay at a 45-degree angle, stepping his boot hard onto the iron head to cut through the thick roots of Johnson grass. It was heavy, wet work that made his shoulders ache after 10 minutes. His school shoes were caked in mud, and the skin on his palms had begun to split, but he kept digging. He had only 3 months before the winter floods would rise. The rain returned as a cold mist. At 5:30 a.m., Everett's grandfather Lester hobbled down the bank. He carried a hot thermos of ginger tea, his boots sinking into the mud. He stood there watching the boy pile loose dirt along the water's edge. "You're wasting your strength, boy," Lester said, his voice raspy. Everett wiped his brow, leaving a streak of black mud across his forehead. "I'm building a wall, Grandpa. I have to keep the creek out." "That creek will eat a dirt wall in 10 minutes, Lester said. He knelt despite his bad knees and reached into the mud. He pulled out a thin green branch of a black willow. "The water wants to move. If you fight it with a hard wall of dirt, it will break you. But if you give the land the right tools and enough time, son, she will hold you." Lester pressed the willow stick deep into the wet clay. Willows don't fight the water. They bend. Their roots go down 10 feet. They weave into the soil like a net. It binds the clay from the inside. Everett recalled his grandfather's stories about the Great Flood of 1968, when the water rose so high it washed away the old covered bridge in Liberty. The concrete bridges broke. Lester had told him, but the old trees along the bank held. Their roots had been there for a century. They knew how to hold the soil because they were part of it. Dale Crane, Everett's father, walked down to the edge of the field. He saw his elderly father-in-law and his 15-year-old son standing in the mud. Dale had 40 acres to manage and a tobacco crop to harvest. He looked at the thin willow sticks, then at his son's ruined school shoes. "Don't be late for the school bus," Everett Dale said quietly, then turned and walked back toward the barn. Everett looked at the yellowed pamphlet in his pocket. He had $120 saved from stacking hay for the Atchisons. It was all his money. That afternoon he sat at the kitchen table and wrote a letter to the state nursery ordering 50 black willow whips. The box arrived 2 weeks later. It was a long, heavy crate made of rough pine delivered by the local mail carrier. Everett's older brother Micah carried it into the barn. Micah was 17 strong and won the blue ribbons at the county fair. He threw the crate onto the straw and laughed. "You spent your $120 on this, Everett?" Micah asked, splitting the pine slats with a crowbar. "It's just a bunch of dead wood. Looks like kindling for the stove." Inside the crate were 50 black willow whips, 3 feet long, stripped of leaves, wrapped in wet burlap. They looked dry and worthless. "It's not kindling," Everett said, lifting one of the cold, flexible sticks. "We have 10 acres of tobacco to cut before the first freeze," Micah said, walking out. "And you're playing with sticks." His mother, Ruth Ann, stood by the barn door. She looked at Everett's tired face and his blistered hands. "Everett, your grades are slipping," she said gently. "You can't spend your nights down by the creek. You need your sleep." "I'll finish my homework," Ma Everett said, "and I'll clean the cow stalls every afternoon. I promise." To keep his promise, Everett had to wake up at 4:30 a.m. He lit his father's old kerosene lamp, the brass base cold in his hands. By the yellow light he walked down to the dark creek. He pressed the first willow whip into the frozen mud, the cold clay stinging his fingers. He had 50 sticks to plant and the sky was already turning gray. But what he didn't know was that the worst winter freeze in 10 years was already moving toward Casey County. It was a cold Tuesday morning in early November when the rumble of a heavy engine broke the silence of the valley. Gus Whitfield, the wealthiest and most influential cattle farmer in the county, stopped his white Ram 3500 pickup truck at the edge of the property line. The truck's massive mud-terrain tires spun in the soft earth, throwing a thick spray of wet, gray clay right onto Everett's shirt. Gus didn't roll down his window to apologize. Instead, he spit a stream of dark tobacco juice onto the ground, let out a loud laugh, and leaned over the steering wheel, looking down at the young boy. "What in the world are you doing, boy?" Gus yelled over the loud rumble of his Cummins diesel engine. "You planting sticks in the mud? You think that's going to save your dad's farm?" Everett didn't answer. He stood in the freezing creek bank, the cold water soaking through the worn-out soles of his boots. Harlan Beecham, a neighbor who was helping Gus haul hay for his cattle, leaned against the passenger door and chuckled. "Looks like he's trying to grow a forest," Gus Harlan called out, shaking his head. "Or maybe he's just playing hide-and-seek with the creek." Harlan Beecham's farm was located just 3 miles north of the Cranes. He had a small herd of Angus cattle and a red barn that had been painted 3 times. He was a practical man who didn't believe in government pamphlets or new theories. "If it was that easy," Harlan said at the diner, "everyone would be planting weeds instead of building fences." "You're wasting your time, kid," Gus scoffed, his face red with amusement. "A 15-year-old black boy with a borrowed shovel isn't going to stop Coldwater Creek. You want to save that soil. You need real machinery. You need concrete. What you've got there is just a bunch of cheap dead wood from Lester's backyard. It'll wash away with the first good rain." Everett felt a hot surge of anger in his chest. His hands gripped the wooden handle of Lester's old spade so hard his knuckles turned white. His grandfather's voice warned him in his head to stay calm, to remember that anger is like hot water, it only burns the one who holds it. He looked down at the mud, took a slow, deep breath, and pressed his boot onto the spade to dig another hole. Gus laughed again, slammed the truck into gear, and roared off, leaving a cloud of black diesel exhaust that stung Everett's throat and eyes. 3 days later, Gus proved what he meant by real machinery. At 7 a.m., the ground began to shake with a low vibration. A massive cat excavator rolled down to the north bank of the creek, its metal tracks grinding over the river stones with a deafening noise. For 10 days, the peaceful valley was filled with the roar of engines, the smell of grease, and the clang of metal. Gus had hired a professional construction crew from Murray. They poured truckloads of gravel and built heavy wooden frames along his bank to prepare for the concrete pour. Inside the Murray construction office, the walls were covered with blueprints of highways and steel bridges. Gus Whitfield had walked in with his leather boots, slammed his hand on the counter, and demanded the strongest wall money could buy. "I don't care about the cost," Gus had said to the engineer. "Just make sure the water doesn't touch my cows. I want steel and concrete." Gus spent $20,000 on that wall. Harlan Beecham told the farmers at the feed store on Saturday morning, sitting around the old wooden stove with a cup of black coffee, 2 feet of solid concrete reinforced with steel rebar. He's locking that creek down for good. The Cranes. They'll lose their whole south field by next spring. They don't have $20,000 to throw at the water. That kid's willows will just be swept away. It was true. The Crane family was already struggling to pay off the bank for their tobacco crop, which had suffered from the summer drought. Dale Crane, Everett's father, stood by the barn door in the evenings, watching the cement trucks pour their heavy gray loads across the creek. A bank loan officer had called him twice that week, offering to refinance the farm at a higher interest rate to build a similar concrete wall. "We can't take on more debt, son," Dale told Everett that evening at the kitchen table, his voice heavy with worry. "But I look at what you're doing down there. Those little sticks. Are you sure they'll hold? Or are we just delaying the inevitable?" "Grandpa Lester said they will," Dad Everett said, looking up from his biology homework. "The roots will hold the soil. We just need to give them time to grow." Dale looked at the boy's tired eyes, then nodded slowly. The next morning, Everett found a wooden wheelbarrow parked by the barn filled with smooth creek stones. Dale had gathered them before dawn. The news of the Crane boys' stick wall spread quickly through Casey County. People chuckled about it at the diner and the co-op. Micah, Everett's brother, was furious. The farm work was falling on his shoulders while Everett spent his mornings down by the creek. "You're being lazy, Everett," Micah snapped one evening in the cow stalls, throwing a bale of straw against the wooden wall. "I'm cutting tobacco till my back breaks and you're down there playing in the mud before school. Neighbors are laughing at us. They think we've lost our minds." "I'm not playing, Micah," Everett said quietly, shoveling manure out of the stall. "I'm trying to save the field. If we lose the south field, we lose the farm." The next morning, a hard windstorm swept through the valley. It knocked down the temporary wooden fence Everett had built to keep the cattle away from the new plantings. Everett walked down to the creek at 5 a.m. and found half of his willow whips trampled into the mud by the cows. His heart sank. The cold rain was freezing on the grass, and his fingers were too stiff to tie the rope. He wanted to sit down in the mud and cry, but he thought of the 4 acres of land his father was about to lose. Everett spent the next 4 hours in the dark, cutting wild briars and thorny branches from the woods to build a thick, natural barrier. By the time the school bus honked its horn at 6:30 a.m., Everett was running up the hill, his clothes torn by thorns and his hands bleeding from the briars. Harlan Beecham drove past on his tractor, looked at the boy's bleeding fingers, and shook his head. "The kid is stubborn," Harlan murmured to himself, "just like his grandfather. But he's fighting a losing battle against the river and against Gus." Winter arrived with a brutal force in mid-January. A record-breaking freeze swept through Casey County, turning Coldwater Creek into a solid sheet of thick gray ice. The temperature dropped to 0 degrees, and the wind howled through the loose boards of Everett's bedroom window. At 11:45 p.m., he couldn't sleep. He knew the ice was expanding, crushing the delicate willow roots beneath the clay. He put on his heavy coat, grabbed his flashlight, and ran down the slippery slope. As he tried to drag a thick canvas tarp over the youngest row of plantings, his boots slipped on a patch of black ice. Everett crashed hard onto his knees, a sharp rock cutting right through his jeans. He sat in the dark, his knee throbbing with pain, and looked at the frozen creek. By the beam of his flashlight, he saw that half of his black willow whips had been burnt gray and withered by the frost. The frozen soil was hard as granite. He couldn't drive his spade into it. Everett felt a cold wave of despair. He threw the heavy canvas tarp onto the snow, picked up his spade, and threw it down. "I can't do this," he whispered into the wind, his breath forming thick white clouds. "It's just dead wood." Micah was right. It's too cold and the earth doesn't want these plants. But as he sat there, shivering, his grandfather Lester's voice echoed in his mind. "If you give the land the right tools and enough time, son, she will hold you." Everett closed his eyes, swallowed the lump in his throat, and stood up. He walked back to the barn, filled 2 buckets with hot water from the dairy heater, and carried them down to the creek. He poured the warm water over the frozen clay, melting the ice, and replanted the willow whips. His fingers were completely numb, his skin cracked and bleeding from the cold, but he didn't stop until the last whip was back in the ground. By late April, the ice had melted and tiny green buds began to sprout along the willow whips. But spring brought a new threat. A massive swarm of aphids, small, sap-sucking insects, invaded the creek bank, coating the fresh green leaves in a sticky, destructive film. Gus Whitfield drove past on the county road, rolled down the window of his shiny truck and pointed. "Told you so," Gus shouted, his voice echoing across the water. "Those cheap broom handles of yours are nothing but food for the bugs. They'll be dead by next week." Everett didn't have money to buy chemical pesticides. The co-op wanted $150 for a single jug. Everett sat on the porch with his grandfather's USDA pamphlet. He found a natural recipe. He spent the next afternoon grinding 5 pounds of wild garlic and red-hot peppers in his mother's kitchen, mixing the spicy paste with liquid dish soap and water. The garlic and pepper mixture was so potent that even the family hound, a blue tick coonhound named Buster, ran out of the kitchen and stayed in the barn for 2 days. Everett's hands were stained yellow from the garlic juice, and the smell was so strong he had to wash his skin with vinegar 3 times before it finally went away. The steam from the boiling pot filled the Crane family's small kitchen, making his mother cough. "Everett, what are you cooking?" Ruth Ann asked, laughing through her tears. "It smells like a volcano in here." "It's medicine for the trees," Ma Everett said, stirring the thick red mixture. He filled a small hand pump sprayer and spent 3 hours spraying each individual leaf. The spicy mist got into his eyes and nose, making him cough and weep. The strong odor of garlic and pepper clung to his clothes. The next day on the school bus, the other kids moved 3 rows away from him, whispering and plugging their noses. But Everett didn't care. That night, he saw a flickering light down by the creek. He walked down and found his father, Dale. Dale had built 3 small, smoky fires using damp cedar branches, letting the thick white smoke drift over the willow plantings to drive away the insects. Dale didn't say a word. He just handed Everett a thermos of hot ginger tea, patted him once on the shoulder, and kept tending the fires. By morning, the aphids were gone. Micah looked at Everett's hands that night, seeing the raw skin and the dirt under his fingernails. He didn't say anything, but the next morning Everett found a pair of leather work gloves sitting on his boots by the front door. They were Micah's old gloves, worn thin at the thumbs, but they were better than nothing. By the end of the second summer, the black willows had grown taller than Everett's shoulders. The creek bank was covered in a dense green wall of flexible branches. The local children began to call him the Willow Boy, no longer laughing but watching with curiosity. Across the water, Gus Whitfield's concrete wall was finished. It stood white and straight, a $20,000 monument to modern construction. Gus had painted it and even hosted a small barbecue for the county commissioners to show it off. "It looks pretty, Everett," Harlan Beecham said, stopping by the fence line. "But when the autumn floods come down from the Cumberland, that willow wood is going to snap like toothpicks." Everett didn't argue. He spent his afternoons working with his grandfather Lester, gathering heavy stones from the dry riverbeds. They piled the stones in interlocking rows between the willow trunks, building a dry stone wall that snuggled into the root network. Everett's shoulders ached from the heavy lifting. His boots were held together by duct tape. Then, in mid-October, the weather changed. The sky turned the color of bruised iron. The local radio station in Liberty began broadcasting a flood warning. A massive storm was moving up from the south, predicted to dump more rain on Casey County than any storm in 30 years. Everett stood on the bank looking at the dark water of Coldwater Creek. He reached out and touched the rough bark of the central willow. He felt the tension in the wood. The storm was 12 hours away, and the ultimate test was about to begin. The rain didn't fall in drops. It fell in heavy sheets day after day, turning the clay of Casey County into a soft, red soup. By the 11th consecutive day of rain, the hills were saturated. Small streams of muddy water ran down the dirt roads like veins. At 8:30 p.m., the sky was a pitch-black canvas, broken only by the flash of lightning. The thunder shook the old floorboards of the Crane house. Down in the valley, Coldwater Creek had turned into a roaring monster. The water was no longer clear. It was a thick brown slurry of mud, carrying dead tree branches, old wooden fence posts, and plastic trash. Everett stood in the freezing rain, his yellow slicker soaked through. The water was already up to his thighs, cold enough to make his bones ache. He had a fever, a dry cough rattling in his chest, but he refused to go inside. He held a bundle of willow branches, binding them to the front of his stone wall with thick wire. "Everett, get up here!" Harlan Beecham screamed through the roar of the wind. Harlan was on his tractor, desperately trying to pull 3 cows out of the rising mud. "The creek is about to break its bank. You're going to get yourself drowned, boy. Leave those sticks." Everett didn't stop. He twisted the wire tight, his numb fingers bleeding onto the wet bark. "Just one more," Everett yelled back, though the wind swallowed his voice. He drove the last willow stake into the clay, his school shoes completely lost somewhere in the mud. He crawled up the bank, shivering as the water rose another 3 inches. At 5 a.m. the next morning, the rain stopped, but the silence was terrifying. The killdeer birds, which usually nested in the mudflats along the creek, suddenly took flight. A flock of 50 birds flew in chaotic circles, screaming their shrill warning as they headed for the high ridge. Then came the sound. It didn't sound like rushing water. It sounded like the low, deep whistle of a heavy freight train rushing down a mountain. It was the flash flood coming down from the headwaters of the Cumberland River. Dale Crane stood on the porch, his hand resting on his wife Ruth Ann's shoulder. They stood in silence, watching the brown wall of water roar around the bend of the creek. Everett stood next to them, his grandfather Lester's old brass lamp clutched in his hands. If the bank broke, their 4 acres of corn would be replaced by a field of gravel and sand, ruining them for good. Across the creek, Gus Whitfield stood on his concrete wall. He wore a heavy yellow rain suit and stood with his boots planted on the dry, solid concrete. He looked across the water at the Crane family, let out a loud laugh, and shook his fist in the air. "You should have built concrete," Dale Gus yelled, his voice carrying over the water. "Those twigs are going to feed the fish." Everett didn't look at Gus. He looked at the base of the concrete wall where the brown water was beginning to swirl. The flood wave hit at 8 feet high. It struck both banks with the force of a train wreck. A massive 50-foot oak log floating down from the logging camps upstream was caught in the current. It spun like a missile and smashed directly into the center of Gus Whitfield's concrete wall. The sound of the impact was like a gunshot echoing through the valley. Because concrete is hard and rigid, it could not absorb the shock. The log didn't bounce off. It transferred all its force into the wall. At the same time, the fast-moving water swirled under the concrete foundation. Concrete has no roots. It has no way to hold the soil beneath it. Within minutes, the rushing water had washed away the soft sand beneath the concrete footer, leaving the massive wall hanging in the air. Everett watched as a tiny crack appeared in the white-painted surface of Gus's wall. In 5 seconds, the crack spread like a spider web. "No," Gus screamed, taking a step back. With a deafening roar, the $20,000 concrete wall snapped in 3 pieces. The massive slabs of concrete fell forward into the rushing water, disappearing under the mud. With the wall gone, the water rushed into Gus's pasture, washing away 60 feet of prime grass and his expensive iron fence in a matter of seconds. The water tore a massive raw hole into Gus's land, leaving nothing but an empty mud pit. The flood didn't stop at Gus's property. After tearing away the concrete wall, the massive force of the brown water surged across the creek bed, roaring directly toward the south bank of the Crane farm. Dale Crane clutched Everett's shoulder, his fingers digging into the wet fabric of the boy's jacket. "Get back, Everett," Dale shouted over the deafening noise. "It's coming straight for us. The whole bank is going to go." But Everett didn't move. He stood his ground on the muddy slope, his boots buried deep in the clay. "Look, Dad," Everett screamed, pointing down into the churning water. "The roots they're holding, they're not giving way." The force of the flood was unbelievable. It slammed into the rows of black willows with a sound like a physical blow, a wet, heavy thud that shook the earth under their feet. The branches, which were now over 6 feet tall and thick as a man's wrist, didn't snap. Unlike Gus's concrete wall, they didn't stand rigid against the water. They bent. They leaned flat against the current, their flexible branches weaving together to form a thick green shield that absorbed the river's anger. Beneath the water, the true work was happening. The network of roots, which Everett had spent 2 years planting and protecting, acted like a massive steel mesh. Millions of tiny root fibers held the wet clay together, refusing to let a single grain of soil wash away. The heavy creek stones that Everett and his grandfather had piled between the trunks stayed in place, locked down by the thick roots wrapping around them like wooden fingers. The flood swirled, hissed, and hammered against the green barrier, but it couldn't find a weak spot. It was forced to slide along the willow wall, its energy dissipating before flowing harmlessly back into the main channel. Dale watched in absolute silence, his chest rising and falling as he breathed in the cold, damp air. For the first time in 10 days, the tension in his shoulders vanished. Everett leaned against a willow trunk, his feverish body shaking, but a tired smile broke across his face. The 4 acres of fertile soil, their family's future, were safe. Not a single inch of the bank had collapsed. The willows had held the line. By 8 a.m., the next morning, the storm had passed. The clouds broke, letting a pale Kentucky sun shine down on the valley. The water of Coldwater Creek was still high, but it had retreated back into its channel, running a muddy brown. Harlan Beecham walked down the county road, his heavy boots squelching in the mud. He stopped at the edge of the bridge that separated the two properties. He looked to the left at Gus Whitfield's land. It was a disaster area. Where the concrete wall had stood, there was only a massive raw crater of red clay. 60 feet of prime pasture had been eaten by the creek, and the expensive iron fence was gone, twisted like wire under the mud. Then Harlan turned his head and looked to the right at the Crane farm. He blinked in disbelief. The willows were battered, some of their leaves stripped away, but they were all standing. The stone wall was intact. Even better, the slow-moving water behind the willow barrier had deposited a fresh 2-inch layer of rich, dark silt onto the Crane field. The land hadn't lost soil. It had gained it. Harlan Beecham reached down and picked up a handful of the fresh silt that had deposited behind the willow wall. He rubbed it between his fingers, feeling the rich, sandy texture of the soil. "This is prime bottomland," Harlan muttered, looking at the fields. "Usually a flood like this leaves nothing but gravel, but this is gold." Micah Crane walked down from the barn carrying a bucket of feed. He stopped next to Everett, who was kneeling in the mud checking the trunk of a willow. Micah looked at the creek, then at his younger brother. He set the bucket down, walked over, and wrapped his arm around Everett's neck, pulling him into a rough hug. "I'm sorry, little brother," Micah muttered, his voice thick. "I was wrong. You saved us. I thought you were just playing around, but you actually saved this farm." Everett looked up at his brother, his eyes red from lack of sleep. "We saved it, Micah. We did it together." Harlan Beecham walked across the bridge, his Stetson hat clutched in his hands. He stood in the mud next to the two brothers, looking at the willow roots. "I've farmed in Casey County for 40 years, Harlan said, shaking his head. "I thought I knew everything about this land, but today I had to be taught how to save soil by a 15-year-old boy. I'm sorry, Everett. I shouldn't have doubted you." Everett wiped his dirty hands on his jeans. "It wasn't just me, Mr. Beecham. It was Grandpa's willows. They did the work. If it weren't for his USDA guide, we wouldn't have known what to do." A few minutes later, the loud rumble of a ram truck approached. Gus Whitfield drove slowly down the mud road, stopping near the edge of his collapsed bank. The truck was caked in mud, its shiny chrome wheels dull. Gus climbed out of the cab. He didn't look like the wealthy, confident man who had spit tobacco juice 2 weeks ago. His shoulders were slumped, his face pale and tired. He stood at the edge of the raw clay crater, looking down at the fragments of his $20,000 concrete wall. The broken blocks lay in the mud like headstones, half submerged in the brown silt. Gus Whitfield's ram truck sat idling on the gravel road, its engine ticking as it cooled down in the morning air. The passenger door was open, and the radio was playing a country song from a station in Nashville. Gus didn't turn it off. He just sat on his tailgate, looking at his collapsed field with his head in his hands. Dale Crane walked down to the edge of the water. He didn't laugh, and he didn't boast. He stood with his hands in his pockets, looking across the creek at his neighbor with respect. Gus looked up, his eyes meeting Dale's. Then he looked at Everett, who stood next to his father, the rusted iron spade still in his hand. Gus cleared his throat, his voice raspy. "I lost 60 feet of pasture, Dale. The bank is going to call my loan if I can't stop this erosion. I don't know what to do anymore. I spent $20,000, and it's all gone." He looked at the green wall of willows on the Crane side, standing strong against the current. "Everett," Gus called out, his voice cracking. "What did you plant over there? How did those little sticks hold that water?" Everett stepped forward, his boots squelching in the mud. He looked at the man who had mocked him, then down at the spade. "They're black willows, Mr. Whitfield," Everett said. "They don't fight the creek. They weave it. If you try to block the water, it wins. If you let it flow through the roots, it loses." Gus stared at the boy for a long moment, then slowly nodded his head. The arrogance was completely gone. He looked down at the mud, defeated. Everett reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, wet notepad he used for his high school chemistry class. The pages were damp from the rain, but the grid lines were still visible. With his cold, trembling fingers, he used a stubby, worn-down pencil to write down an address: Lester Bowen's Willow Nursery, Route 4, Casey County. He walked slowly across the wooden bridge that marked the boundary between their properties. He handed the wet slip of paper to Gus Whitfield. "My grandfather has 3,000 black willow cuttings ready in his greenhouse," Mr. Whitfield Everett said quietly, his voice calm. "If you start planting them this spring, the root network will be locked into your clay pasture before the autumn storms return. You won't need to pour concrete again. It's cheap and it actually works." Gus looked down at the small handwritten paper, his thick calloused fingers tracing the pencil marks. He didn't say a word. He didn't spit tobacco juice, and he didn't laugh. He just gave a slow, respectful nod, folded the paper carefully, and slipped it into his shirt pocket. "Thank you, son," Gus muttered. By March of the following year, the valley had transformed. The heavy cat excavators and cement trucks did not return to Coldwater Creek. Instead, the cool spring air was filled with the sound of neighborly chatter and the metallic ring of spades striking the stony earth. Harlan Beecham brought his tractor to help haul the heavy creek stones, and the Atchison brothers brought their own shovels. Even Gus Whitfield's ranch hands helped dig the trenches. It wasn't just about saving one field anymore. It was about saving the entire creek. Harlan Beecham, the Atchison brothers, and even Gus Whitfield stood knee-deep in the cold mud along the banks, working side by side with Everett Micah and 74-year-old Lester Bowen. They carried bundles of fresh willow whips from Lester's nursery, planting them every 3 feet along both sides of the water. They worked from sunrise to sunset, their boots covered in mud, but no one complained. Gus Whitfield even brought a large cooler of cold water and sandwiches for everyone, sharing them on the tailgate of his pickup. The Atchison brothers brought their 2 sons, who were 12 and 14 years old. They carried the willow whips in plastic buckets, following their father down the bank. The boys laughed and competed to see who could plant their row faster, their voices carrying across the water. It felt more like a county fair than a workday. Together they planted willow whips along 2 miles of the winding creek bank, creating a dense green belt that would protect the entire valley's farmland for generations. Gus Whitfield's construction crew came back, but not to build another wall. They brought 3 truckloads of topsoil, dumping it into the raw crater on Gus's land, smoothing it out so the willow roots could take hold. Gus himself stood in the mud holding a bundle of whips, his expensive boots caked in red clay. Everett refused to accept a single dollar for his labor or his grandfather's plants. He only asked that they help his father Dale stack hay during the hot summer harvest. By July, Everett sat on the front porch with his grandfather Lester, drinking cold sweet tea. Down by the creek, the black willows were thick green and full of life, their branches swaying in the southern wind. The south cornfield was lush, its soil dry and secure under the shade of the branches. Lester looked at the green leaves and smiled. "You did a good job, Everett," the old man said, his hands shaking slightly as he held his cup. "Your grandmother would have been proud of this wall." Everett took a sip of his tea. "It was your idea, Grandpa. I just dug the holes." "No," Lester said, shaking his head. "I had the knowledge, but you had the spade. Knowledge without labor is just like seeds left in the bag. It doesn't grow anything." The narrator paused, looking at the green barrier. "You see, in a world that is always rushing to build bigger, louder, and more expensive things, it's easy to look at a boy planting sticks in the mud and laugh. We think concrete is strong because it is hard. But nature has a different kind of strength. It is the strength of patience, flexibility, and time. Sometimes the most practical things look foolish to those who rush. But if you give the land the right tools and enough time, son, she will always hold you." There are thousands of young men like Everett Crane working in the quiet, forgotten corners of rural America. They don't have business cards. They don't have construction companies. And they don't have $20,000 to throw at every problem. They only have a rusted spade, a handful of willow cuttings, and a deep, quiet respect for the earth beneath their boots. They are the ones who understand that the land is not something to be conquered with steel, concrete, and heavy machinery. It is something to be listened to be nurtured, and to be worked with. They understand that true strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it just patiently holds its ground. It bends in the storm, but it never breaks. In the end, Coldwater Creek teaches us that the best solutions are not always the ones that cost the most money or make the most noise. Sometimes the best solutions are the ones that work with nature instead of fighting it. They are the ones that require us to listen to the land, to understand its history, and to have the patience to let it grow. When you look at Coldwater Creek today, you won't see Gus Whitfield's concrete wall. It is still buried under the mud, a silent reminder of what happens when we try to fight the river with brute force. But you will see the willows. They are tall now, their branches swaying in the wind, their roots deep and strong, holding the banks of Casey County together. They stand as a green monument to a 15-year-old boy who refused to give up, and a grandfather who knew the secret of the land. Every spring the willows bloom, dropping new seeds along the water, expanding the green shield further down the valley. The neighbors now call it Everett's Green Wall, a testament to what one kid with a borrowed shovel can do when he trusts the soil. Every year, the County Soil Conservation Office visits the Crane Farm, taking photos of the willow wall to show to other farmers in the state. They call it a model of bioengineering, but to Everett, it's just Grandpa's sticks. It is the work of a boy who loved his family's land enough to stand in the freezing mud and dig. What did Everett's story teach you about patience and the land? Have you ever seen a simple natural solution defeat a massive, expensive engineering project? Drop a comment below to tell us where in the world you are watching from, and subscribe to join our growing farming family. We have another story coming tomorrow, one about a farmer in Georgia who faced a different kind of threat and the hidden skill that saved his family's homestead. You won't want to miss it. Until then, keep your boots in the soil, do the work that others laugh at, and remember what Lester told the boy: if you give the land the right tools and enough time, she will always hold you.